Anyway, we're going to begin this panel. The composition of the panel has changed somewhat, as you can see, because the representative of the European Union could not show up. They have an important meeting today with the Prime Minister or with the licenses for the truck drivers. So we have a slightly different composition. Milan Igrutinovic could not show up either for personal reasons, so we have Milica Vulic instead. I will be very short in introductions so we can get into a discussion quickly. First, next to me is John Fleck. He's the director of the European Center of the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., and German by origin, right? But takes a very American perspective, I assume, if you look at it from Washington.
No one's perfect, as I like to say when people point out I'm German. So.
Yeah, right. Nicolas Pontara, he's the country representative of the World Bank. Milica Vulic, who I think a lot of people should know, has been a professor at the University of Perugia for a long time, deals with the Western Balkans, European integration, things of that nature, and Stefan Vladisavljev, who is a rising analyst and rising star in analyzing international political developments, mostly concentrating on China and China's presence in the Western Balkans and its investments. So, and you know me, I've been here for a long time and doing this. Maybe you should find somebody else. Maybe it's high time so I'm not going to introduce myself. Now, before we had it, I write these briefs for the panelists about a week before the panel because all kinds of things can happen, and I wrote a brief last week, but obviously things have changed. So we will come back to the original theme, but first I would like to have John Fleck reflect a little bit on what happened in terms of the attack on Iran by Israel and the United States, and where we are now, and how he sees things evolving. If he can, nobody knows, but give it your best shot.
Okay. I'll give it my best shot. Thank you, Ivan, for that introduction, and thank you to the organizers of the Kopernik Business Forum for having me my first time here. I hope it starts a tradition of many more visits. So, with that easy question, about U.S. military action against Iran in the Middle East. Look, I think President Trump continues to be the one thing he's been, certainly throughout his first year of his second term, and that is a major disruptor of the status quo. I think not many people saw, or many people expected he would go to military action just because he had sort of boxed himself in. We had seen the Venezuela action. We'd seen the rhetoric on the U.S. side. I think things are going to get a lot more complicated. We haven't seen a clear definition of objectives for this military operation. We haven't seen a clear plan of how to achieve those non-existent objectives. We've just had this vague warning of it will get worse and it will take some time, several weeks. And I think it's an incredibly difficult balance between maintaining deterrence, maintaining U.S. credibility and reliability vis-a-vis regional allies in the Gulf and beyond that, managing this escalation that we've seen from the regime in Tehran, where it's clear that this regime, especially after the death of the supreme leader, considers this a question of survival. That's where we've seen this escalation with the missile attacks, bringing in Hezbollah and proxies, attacks on U.S., French, UK bases. And there's plenty of room for miscalculations and mistakes, as we're very unfortunately have seen in Kuwait, where Kuwait mistook U.S. aircraft, and luckily I think all of those airmen got out alive, but still that just shows you how quickly all of this can go wrong. And then I think the last point I would make here is that on the domestic front, this is a really risky play for the president, because the coalition he assembled to get him reelected or elected for his second term, one of the key uniting factors was this end to these forever wars in the Middle East, and here we are. And this action is hugely unpopular with the American people. And with sort of 8 months out from the midterm elections, this is a really risky play on that front as well. So I'm sorry not to have predictions for how this unfolds, but there is huge risk and downside here.
Yeah, I think everybody will agree with that. So, but thanks for that, for those thoughts. Now, let's go back to last year when we had this panel. We talked about what was it that made America change its mind over Ukraine with the second Trump administration, or the second coming of Trump. Anyway, so there were various ideas. Is this the Belgian Congo concerning the mineral deal with Ukraine? Was this the Munich conference where the famous Munich deal? Was it Yalta? I think most people centered sort of for Yalta as a dividing line on spheres of influence and whatever. But the shocking thing that came out later was the national security strategy of the United States, in which the American president basically canceled, I use that word, canceled 30 years of American foreign policy, basically saying it was all wrong. Globalization was wrong and detrimental to the United States, and all the previous administrations, starting from the fall of the Berlin Wall onwards, everything about it was wrong. It was going to do the different things. Now, this especially reflects on the whole Ukraine, Putin, Trump negotiations, deals, implicit deals, or whatever. So maybe we should start with Milica now and ask her, it seems that the war in Ukraine is an existential question for Europe and how it ends. What do you think, Milica? How would the European Union, does this see the Ukrainian war ending? Because it needs to end. It's going on for a long time. And in the first round, you stood by Joe Biden, who was very aggressive about we have to support Ukraine, and then the American president changed his mind, made a 180-degree turn. And so where's Europe now in terms of the Ukraine war, and how sees that ending, and how this reflects on the relationship with the United States, please?
Well, it's very difficult to say, because there's so many different opinions within the EU. And, we're witnessing daily the discussions between Italy and Germany, and somehow, surely, what has emerged in this last period is that the European Union is trying to have a more united stance, but that is not easy, precisely because there's no common opinion about what should be done. And of course, there have been some decisions already made about more military expenditures, etc. But now, especially with the new war that has just started, I think the whole of the European Union is really in a mess, and I don't know what solutions will actually be taken. I'm sorry, I can say very little, because we're really living a very dramatic moment. And
yeah, but you could say they're pledging another 90 billion to Ukraine. Macron is behind them. So is Merz, basically. The Baltics and the Poles and whatever. Most of the Europeans are basically behind the Ukraine still, except for Hungary and Slovakia, or whatever. So it looks like seems to me it's a pretty united front. The problem is, what's the exit? How do they see the peace coming? And in that context, they've been offering the Ukraine membership, but that will not come immediately, like the Ukrainians are expecting to become part of the European Union. Can you comment on that immediately? That's not going to happen, is it?
That is definitely not going to happen. Despite all the promises, I think that is simply technically not affordable. Ukraine is a huge country. It's an agricultural country. It would cost enormous amount of resources having it in, but not only, the war has still not ended. So letting a country in, it's really simply promises which cannot deliver for now. It's been done for political reasons to try and find a solution for a peace settlement, but even if the war ends, I don't think that Ukraine could be let into the European Union so easily, precisely because it would cost the European Union much more than letting all the Western Balkans in, you know, in budgetary terms and so on. So, you know, it's all political, and I think that, of course, they're doing it for the sake of encouraging the Ukrainians, but I don't think it can happen.
I agree with you. I don't think Ukraine would have ever been on the agenda if it had not been for the war. And the estimate cost was something like 187 billion euro just for the accession of Ukraine, but we'll see. Now, obviously, though, there is a tension. There is a big difference between the United States, and there's been tension in NATO, and there's been all this stuff going on. But before John comments on that and how this transatlantic unity has been in the minds of many shattered in a deeper way, what about the people that might be gaining, or the people might be gaining from this, in the sense of, and I will quote Mao Zedong, okay? The world is in chaos. It's a great time for us, meaning for the communists. So maybe Stefan, who deals with China, can give us the view of China on what's happening in the world and how he sees this, the evolution of the American stand on the Ukraine versus the transatlantic sort of little feuds and implicit feuds between the United States and Europe from the Chinese perspective.
Well, thank you for that question. Thank you for having me here. I'm going to dare to say that a lot of things that are happening right now are actually very much contributing to the point and to the overall goal that China is trying to achieve over the past, especially now 14 years since Xi Jinping came to power. And that is a sort of a remodeling of the global system of governance, with having not one, as Chinese narrative tends to go, hegemon, dealing with the international order, and to have sort of a multilateral, based on equal opportunity and just approach, as stated in the documents by the Chinese Communist Party, that we've seen it embodied in documents like Belt and Road and other global initiatives that the Chinese have launched in the meantime. China has tried to position itself as a provider of development, as a country that will not be aggressive to anyone, maybe Taiwan, but that's completely another question, and a country that tends to provide opportunity more than make anyone do anything in sort of a democratic development way or economic development way. How you will deal with that opportunity very much depends on you and your own capacities. That's why we have had those negative examples of Chinese presence that have been seen through the corruption cases, or sort of a debt traps that have been popularized as something that is happening regularly, although it is really not the rule, it's more of an example. Now with ongoing developments, China has taken sort of a neutral but pro-Russian stance, as tends to be said, because if you're not against Russia, you're kind of a pro-Russian in that ambiguous point of view when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And it's going to be very interesting to see what's going to be the stance on the situation in Iran, having in mind that Iran is, if nothing else, close partner through BRICS initiative with China in the attempts of creating sort of a combating platform for cooperation to what North Atlantic Treaty has been in the recent past. And when the dust settles, we can probably see a little bit more of a clear picture whether the results will be a long-standing or not. But what has been probably the biggest success of China over the past 15 years has been the rise of popularity in sort of a global south and in the developing countries, including our own, on the sole premise that you are not an aggressor or that you are not someone who pushes you to do anything. And with now these examples that we are seeing in the recent days, this actually might be another contribution to the Chinese argument that they are not like the current state of the affairs leaders are. So it might be that the global south countries, especially when the dust settles, looks towards Beijing to see whether they are ready to take the leadership in that new global governing system that they are trying to set up over the past couple of decades.
Good. Well, China's taken this role of stability. I mean, China's trying to provide the stability that used to belong to the United States as the hegemon of stability and getting the, enforcing rules, and things should happen the way they were set originally. I would imagine the global south also looks up to China in a lot of ways, and I'll quote Larry Summers, who once said, when I spoke to an African leader, he told me, when we speak to the Chinese, we get an airport. When we talk to you, we get a free lecture on what we should be doing. So, and I think this probably reflects on how a lot of the global south, quote unquote global south, I hate the term, I think it's too broad, but anyway, we'll use it for this occasion, looks towards China more or less, and has obviously China dominance in terms of trade with, in the volume of trade with most of the global south countries. Now, before coming back to John, I'd like to ask Nicholas here on the European state of affairs. I mean, even before all this happened, and there was talk about how Europe has lost a decade because of the austerity measures, because of low growth after the financial crisis, how it is incapable of dealing with its own problems. And then finally, a lot of people looked at the Draghi report and the Letta report saying, well, they were stated the obvious, we're not competitive, we're lagging behind, we're incapable of doing all this. So at the same time now, they are having various demands on the European Union in the sense of, let's fund the war for the Ukraine, let's talk about the accession process of the Ukraine and the others and how much that's going to cost. Let's talk about the reforms that we need to do quickly now, supposedly, because they had a showing in one of these chateaus somewhere of saying that we have, next month we'll do something, meaning like right now almost, we'll do something about that. So what are the costs of all that reform, and what should be done quickly in terms of economics or economic reform, single market, and whatever that needs to be done, and what are the costs of all this, and how do you assess that?
Thanks, Ivan. I have to say that I feel a bit awkward to speak about the European Union, given that Pasquale is not here on the panel. It would have been useful to see whether what I'm about to say resonates with him or with the ambassador. But in any case, I've done some reading. I guess the EU right now is facing a trilemma, if you can put it that way, of concurrent big financial demands. One is, as you say, rapidly increasing defense spending. The second is supporting Ukraine in the long term, but also related to the accession cost that you have mentioned, and also funding these competitive reforms that have been listed in the Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi's report. So let's go one by one. Defense. 2025, the EU defense spending rose to around nearly 400 billion euros. This is a 12% year-on-year increase. It's massive. It's probably destined to increase even further in the future. And given the current geopolitics and the fact that we all now realize the Europeans will be needing to take more responsibility for their own security moving forward. So that's defense. Second is Ukraine support. You mentioned it yourself, this package of 19 billion euros for 26-27, backed in part by the EU budget. In terms of the accession cost, you also mentioned the figure of nearly 200 billion, but this is over 7 years. So this will be around 30 billion annually. And I guess when you consider bringing in Ukraine and the Western Balkans, the political debate in Europe will be difficult, because I think with Ukraine in, because some of the member countries right now that are net beneficiaries of the EU budget will become also net contributors. But if you ask me, my personal opinion without any hats, I think that it's doable. So Europe will have to raise to the occasion and deliver on that. It's most, in my view, the debate, maybe leaving Ukraine aside, whether the Western Balkans are ready to come in and what are they doing now that they have this avenue open for them, but that may be something that we're going to discuss in the second round. The third thing is the Draghi and Letta report. Draghi report, the assumption is an additional 800 billion euros a year in annual investments to support this report. That dwarfs even the accession costs that we just talked about. And this could be done through a mixture of private capital mobilization, an increase in the EU joint debt, although that's always politically difficult, and also national budget contribution. Just to put it in perspective, in the Marshall Plan, in the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War, the beneficiary countries spent around 3% of GDP for reconstruction. Now, the Draghi report assumes almost an expenditure increase of 5% of GDP. So it's massive under whatever lights you want to look at. So the bottom line is that what the EU is going to do? Somebody's got to give. Well, we said as working in development, we saw already that some of this budget devoted to international aid has been dwindling. We saw the cuts also vis-a-vis the United Nations. Some of the bilateral donors' budget have been cut. Ourselves at the World Bank, we have realized that with all the needs out there to bring 1.2 billion people into the job market in the next 10 years, you need to bring market into development. You need to tap into private funds. You cannot do it anymore with public funding and so on and so forth. So I think the sense of urgency is there. The problem with the EU is that you have many countries with high debt burdens. You have France, Italy, Spain for more than 100% of GDP debt levels. You have several countries in this sort of excessive deficit procedures with more than 3% of GDP deficit. You have to spend on welfare, on healthcare, on pension. This is an aging continent. So I guess there is no other way than looking at these reports and see what is feasible. You need to unlock in Europe private investment by making the single market work better, also find ways to mobilize perhaps the high saving that some countries have at the household level and find ways to channel them into productive investments about, in the digital, in green transitions, in increasing productivity, and in getting growth going, right? Because I think Europe really is growing year after year at below potential. So looking forward, and I finish, we might have a European Union in the future maybe less generous in terms of structural funds for new entrants, but maybe a meaner and leaner EU where markets are working better, and that could be a good opportunity also for small open economies like the Western Balkans to come in and reap those benefits. So let me stop here.
Yeah, interesting. That's on the other hand, if you look at the United States, they too have a large debt. They have a large current account deficit. They have all kinds of problems. They have, among other things, they've wrecked the international economic order big time. And that brings me then to John. There's this, the U.S. for a while, the U.S. was accusing China and Russia of being revisionist countries. Actually turned out the United States is the most revisionist power in the world. It's instructive. It's also very interesting that a hegemon who set the rules is actually not changing those rules, but really breaking them and tearing it all apart in a way, at least when it comes to international trade, with the tariffs, with this and that. So, and especially then there's this rift in the alliance, and this is something that Atlantic Council obviously deals with and thinks about a lot and analyzes, is this transatlantic relationship where, okay, yes, Europe has said they will pay more for NATO, which they should have done earlier up to a point, but there seems to be a disdain for Europe on the part of the U.S. administration that says, yeah, you're weak leaders, you're incapable of doing anything, we don't want to do anything with the EU, one bilateral, the EU sort of sucks, it's a bureaucratic mess, et cetera, down the road. So how do you assess all this, and what do you see happening in the near future, and then maybe in the later? I'm asking for your crystal ball all the
Yeah,
time.
yeah, that's okay. I'll do my best. I do want to briefly, because I just came back from Kyiv from 4 days last week, and I wanted to sort of piggyback on some of the things that Milica said, maybe for 2 minutes, just because, I'm not entirely sure that I ever saw credible top-level pledges of immediate or fast-track accession for Ukraine. I don't think any responsible European leader ever said that since 2022. And we all know about the size of Ukraine, the size of its agricultural sector, the needs on the structural fund side, the reconstruction side. I don't think anyone is naive about that. But we have managed that in the past very successfully, with transition periods and other tweaks. I mean, Poland, with its large agricultural sector, only ended its transition period limitations 2 years ago, in 2024, just to give that's 20 years after accession. And so, when people talk about this, like Europe is failing Ukraine, I think Europe should, without patting itself on the back, but we should say what we have actually achieved over the last year. The United States has stepped back on its own weapons supplies. Europe has made up for that 95+%, even if it is Europeans buying American weapons through Pearl. But on many fronts, Europe has done that. On the 90 billion support, on other support in terms of weapons support. So, Europe has stepped up, and Ukrainians do recognize that. And it's actually it's a growing advantage for Ukraine in these negotiations for a peace settlement, whatever you want to call it, because there's less leverage that the United States has over Ukraine than it did a year or 14 months ago. So I think that's really important to put into perspective. And then I think we also need to change from the European side a little bit the narrative on Ukraine. Yes, there are huge challenges. Yes, there has to be some sort of ceasefire and established line and settlement. But Ukraine moving towards EU accession in any shape or form would be a huge shot in the arm for Europe. Because what does Ukraine bring? It brings huge assets and advantages on each of the major challenges that the European Union faces. Security and defense, it has the most modern battle-tested armed forces in Europe, if not in the world, on security and defense. It brings unique experience on the defense technology side. It brings a hugely innovative entrepreneurial population that has lived in a pressure cooker. If half of Europe was as innovative, we wouldn't be talking about Draghi or Letta, for 1 second. And even the agricultural addition to the single market and the global exporter role of the European Union would be, I think, transformative in the medium term. So without being blind to the challenges, we also think need to look at some of that. When it comes to the U.S.-European relationship that you asked about, look, very quickly, I think we need to separate out rhetoric from reality, political and economic realities. This is still the deepest economic relationship that any two countries/regions have in the world, despite all the hype, sorry, Stefan, about China, economically, not from your side, but generally speaking. 2/3 of U.S. investment stock are in Europe, 2/3. Europe accounts for 50+% of FDI inflows into the United States from abroad. We could go down the list. I'll shorten this a little bit. There's huge cooperation still at working level on security and defense, on law enforcement, cyber, intel, like you go through the list. Institutionally consolidated cooperation. And there's, even with this administration, you're seeing cooperation around energy, the vertical corridor, this conference just last week, where 20 European countries were there, including from the Western Balkans, talking about US LNG exports to diversify away from Russia or even the Gulf. You have joint efforts on critical raw materials. So you still have this going on, even if, and we shouldn't be blind about the hugely disruptive, I wouldn't call it revisionist, because we're not going back to anything. But, this administration has certainly been extremely disruptive. So as a European, a proud European and a German in Washington, D.C. now for 15 years, I'll tell you that I'm still optimistic about this relationship in the long term. Yes, there are all of those disruptive and, quite frankly, provocative elements in the U.S. Administration, but it's a coalition. And there are people that are anti-EU, they're anti-European reflexively. And that's a huge challenge. And we've seen that those provocations and challenges certainly all year over the last 12 to 14 months in this administration. At the same time, we've known this relationship has had to change. We've known Europe has had to change for a long time. We just haven't been very honest, and we haven't done our homework on that front. Now it is changing. The super tanker that is the EU of 27, that's a very complicated political animal with all of the divisions and disunity and those that are slower than others and all of this. That's all reality, but the super tanker is turning. And I think we're seeing that from security and defense. Nicola mentioned, over 2020, 2025 defense expenditure of the EU 27 is up 50+%. That's a huge shift. Even if the competitiveness agenda is too slow and not ambitious enough, in my opinion as well, it is changing. Right? We're seeing a different level of political investment in that. Could that all be faster and more ambitious? I'm all for it. It has to change, but Europe is changing, and this relationship will change. And I think Europe needs to focus on what it controls, and that is its own security and its own economic future. Right? And then it needs to set out what its own agenda for this relationship is. And I'll end on this. No one has this type of relationship. Russia can force people to be their friends. China can buy people to be their friends. No one has this level of a strategic relationship. And we need to understand that that's a unique strategic asset. And look what's happening to Russia's and China's friends just this year. If you're the president of Venezuela and you're the friend of both, you find yourself in an American helicopter whisked off to New York overnight. If you're the Iranian regime, we're seeing what it means. There's nothing these guys are doing for their friends. So let's not underestimate this relationship.
No, I don't want to underestimate the relationship, but I want to pursue this just a little bit. There's another factor that cannot be measured, but is important, and it's in people's mind. That's a question of trust. So, like in any relationship among people or trades or whatever, and including between nations, trust is a very important factor. And I have a feeling, though, that the trust has been hampered, it's been damaged, and we'll see how far that goes. And I will tell you another thing. The way I see it, anyway, it's my personal view, obviously, is that the Trump administration is having a revolution at home and abroad. And so it reminds me of communism. They had an ideology of their own. They're pursuing it at home, just like the U.S. is doing with anti-wokeness, this and that, whatever, getting rid of checks and balances, building up the imperial presence as much as it can, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but also exporting revolution, like we will support now, we don't have USAID, but we will support Mr. Orban, we will support this. Our ambassadors in Europe will be actually rooting and stimulating opposition to the people who are in power in Europe to encourage Marine Le Pen, to encourage the AfD, to encourage this and that and whatever. And that's the perception of the political elites of Europe. So I think that's, if you think about that for a second, and I'm sure you have, I'd like to have your response to that. I think that's a very serious dent in the structure that we're talking about.
Absolutely, and I'm not trying to belittle or negate or belittle, minimize the challenges in the relationship and what this administration has done on the front when it comes to European relations with Europe. And absolutely, a lot of trust has been destroyed. That there's no question of that. But I think again, Europe needs to, and the challenges on the domestic. The threats of domestic meddling. Look, I think Europe should have some confidence in its own political resilience. I think the Greenland episode or the threats over Greenland are quite informative. You had the Nigel Farages, the Alice Weidels, and the Marine Le Pens of this world actually saying, no, this is wrong. Their supposed great ally in Donald Trump of these right-wing populist forces, all of them know how unpopular this president is across Europe, and they made a clear-cut calculation that it wasn't in their electoral it wasn't a positive electoral calculus to actually could stay aligned with this president. And then secondly, let's see who gets that money and support and how that works out. Isn't looking too good for Prime Minister Orban right now, if you trust the polling, even the most negative, from the opposition perspective. And a visit by Marco Rubio hasn't helped him boost. So I would be a little bit more, of course, stay vigilant, of course, make clear to this administration where there are red lines for Europe. But I would also say this administration hasn't been the most effective at interacting with and leveraging domestic politics across countries abroad, from Greenland to Hungary. So again, be vigilant, make clear what's unacceptable, but also have a level of confidence in your own abilities and what you're changing as Europe.
Thanks, John. Let's now move to the other topic that we have, and it's a topic we do all the time. It's the Western Balkans and where we are in the context of what we've been talking about. So the new deal is, obviously, there's this talk about how now things have opened up for accession. Personally, I think the European Union has to do something to build its credibility. Its credibility in the Western Balkans is close to zero, for very good reasons. I don't think anybody would, if anyone wants to dispute that, we can carry this further. And I think it has to show, both in terms of the Ukraine and Moldova and the thing of opening up the accession process, that it has to take, one way or another, somebody from the Western Balkans into membership. Obviously, the obvious candidate is Montenegro at this point. And Marta Kos, certainly as the commissioner, has been talking about this, and they've been talking about reforming the procedures, like they would not get a veto. Now, I understand this whole thing in the sense of we don't want to give these countries a veto because the next time around they're going to veto somebody else in their neighborhood when they show up. They have an unsettled history of their own, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But my first question is, and I'll ask Milica of this, is do you think that reforming the European procedures on accepting membership will include something like giving up on the veto principle, or creating sort of a Europe of multi-circles where you have countries like maybe Albania and Montenegro coming in without the power to veto? Personally, I don't think Albania is going to get in, but Montenegro might. So what do you think about this whole talk about the integration process and how it's going to work out, and will it work out at all, given the structure of institutional decision-making in the European Union?
Well, these are some of the key issues that are currently being discussed, precisely because there are member states which are against letting even Montenegro into the EU, precisely because they're afraid that it will disrupt the present balances, etc. But I see a change in this direction. I think it's very feasible, and I think that the leaders in the Western Balkan countries are also ready to accept to have this second-order entry into the European Union, because simply they have been waiting too long. It's been 22 years since the promise in Thessaloniki, and it's really had enormous negative effects, economic, political. I mean, we can discuss about how this very slow process of EU integration of the Western Balkans has really had multiple negative effects. So, under certain conditions, I think this would be a very good moment to actually let all the Western Balkans into the European Union, under certain conditions. Because somehow, if you let Montenegro in, Montenegro is not a country that does not have its own problems, and they're simply being ignored. But then Albania is really heading ahead. Albania also has its own problems. There's been strikes just recently. But somehow, if things were to change in Serbia, the latest declarations are that Serbia is very much in favor of joining the European Union. I mean, it depends on the day. It depends on how the wind blows. I think it's perhaps, I would like to hope that this may be a good moment to actually let the Western Balkans in. They've been, they have these stabilization and association agreements. They have been preparing. They have been adopting the acquis. A lot of technical work has been done. So it's a political decision. And, of course, if the political circumstances allow it, I would be more than happy to see all the countries join the European Union. But it may involve significant changes within the EU, like what you mentioned, the veto, the change in decision-making within the EU, because also linked to what we discussed earlier, if Ukraine is to be let into the European Union, I don't know, a country like North Macedonia, they are the first country that signed a stabilization and association agreement, and they're being blocked by...
Being blocked by the European Union, because, I appreciate what you're saying. I just don't think it's very likely to happen. They're not going to take all the Western Balkans in. There's no way, unfortunately, or whatever. But actually, the European Union has been exporting its instability into North Macedonia, because the French, to pacify the conflict, political conflict and chaos in Bulgaria, they've actually exported the Bulgarian problem to North Macedonia. So when the European talks about security and all this stuff, they've been exporting insecurity into countries that are candidates for the European Union. That's number one. But so I would say that my bet is that we're going to try to push Montenegro in. All the rest will hold, but we'll see. There's time. Hopefully, we'll see when in 2030 or whatever, in a year or two from now, whether this is going to happen. Stefan, the EU and China and its presence in Europe, how do you see that evolving?
I think that we have seen a couple of indicators over the past couple of days that things are probably best put in the category of hedging. At the moment, when it comes to Europe and when it comes towards China, there are two, I would say, main issues. The first one, the obvious one, is Russia. Still, regardless of the economic approach toward China, whoever of the European leaders discuss with Chinese counterparts the topic of cooperation, or they do it in multilateral forums, the topic of Russia is something that has been mentioned as the biggest gap right now in the position towards the war in Ukraine. And the second are different economic issues, including, and what has been mentioned the most has been the overcapacity. the scares that the Chinese overcapacity, but also sort of a monopolistic approach towards rare earths has been something that has been troubling Europeans over the past several years. But with, for example, Chancellor Merz's visit to Beijing, we see that they are trying to mitigate sort of that hard stance that they took towards economic part of cooperation. And that some quid pro quo is being created with Chinese promising that they will buy 30 Airbuses from French, but that Europe will allow sort of access and in quotas with electric vehicles. And that is a sort of a don't make this situation more hard when you have so many issues surrounding you in other areas. We've seen with the response towards the Iranian now attack that I'm terribly sorry, but when you say we will discuss this in 48 hours, that's really not something that will assure you that you have a correct approach towards the crisis situation. When something happens on Saturday and you decide that you will convene on Monday, that's a little bit troublesome when it comes to the response to the conflict situations, and we are seeing that there are more and more, and not less and less. But to put it on strategic level, I do agree that transatlantic partnership has been the staple for both for Europe and US, and something that has been uncontested with any other cooperation forum when it comes to the global governing system. But I'm just going to go back to what I've been talking about in the first round. What if that system changes? I'm going to go back to something that I was taught in school that you have international order, you have no democracies fighting among themselves, but you also have this multilateral approach where, of course, you have the main guy or main guys, but there is still a safeguard in that multilateral forum where you can go and, if nothing else, cry for help or ask for justice. What happens if we just say that doesn't matter anymore? And we are obviously seeing specific evidences that it matters, maybe it just at the moment matters less and less, but what happens if it doesn't matter anymore? China, for example, has been very successful in infiltrating sort of away multilateral forums over the past 15 years. And they kind of take the approach of, we will try to do this by the book. Of course, you can read book different ways, but we will try to do this by the book. Now we see that the most powerful leaders from the transatlantic community are just tossing the book away and trying to write another one. And that is concerning. And that is very hard to say that it is something that will lead to long-lasting peace. And it is something that then all of these commercial, economic, and any other sort of cooperations are, of course, still relevant and still matter, but can be disrupted tomorrow if things go sideways. I can only imagine what is for the service industry in Dubai, what is happening over the past 2 days. I can only imagine that. Or, places similar to that. But when it comes to Europe and China, just the final sentence, Europe will try to hedge the current position. It will not go very harsh as it went maybe 5 or 6 years ago. They will try to create a sort of a benefit of the situation, but they will also be still very critical about concerning issues for them, the pressing issues for them, and that is Russia, and that is sort of a scare over the over-dependency of their own market when it comes to one political and one economic issue right now on the European side of that.
Yeah, but well, certainly we've seen recently, I don't know, Merz going to China. We've seen Mark Carney going to China. We've seen Keith Schwammer going to China, making deals, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems that this idea of, yes, the Europeans will confront China when the United States confronts China in a way doesn't seem to be sort of in line with what has been going on with all these visits recently.
I'm not sure that the United States wants to confront China. I'm quite sure that the United States wants to make an agreement with China.
No, I think so too, because they can't do it in any other way. I mean, they were stood down by Xi Jinping in the raw minerals and rare earths and whatever issue when Trump and Xi Jinping met. But we'll get to that in a second. In fact, why don't we do that now? Why don't you, John, comment on this, and then I'll get to Nicola to talk about something else on the Western Balkans. Question, though, for you is the one that I think I put in the brief, but you can come back to that later, is what does the United States see in this part of the world, in the Western Balkans, except for getting Russia out of the energy business, which was demonstrated recently, except for getting into the energy deal, and except for maybe pushing the Chinese a little bit, like they've been doing here in Linglong, in the factory here, in the tire factory. So, go ahead.
So both China and...
Oh, easy, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we have
Right.
time. We have time. Don't do it.
Quickly on China, I think, I think you're right that President Trump might want to do a deal with China. I think it'll be interesting to watch what those China hawks around him think of such a deal, right? And how that dynamic plays out in the end. And I think the expectation that Europe would have ever aligned with the U.S. position vis-a-vis, or a much harder, tougher position with China was never very realistic. It's just a very different relationship, a different role of the United States in the Indo-Pacific as a security guarantor, as a Pacific power, which Europe isn't. I mean, all of the things that Stefan knows better than most people. And of course, Europe is going to hedge under these pressures. One thing, this sort of making fun of Europe for sort of, this Holy Sunday and can't meet, that's not really what happened, right? It makes for a nice Politico Europe tweet or note. It's not what actually happened. The foreign ministers met virtually. The COREPER, the ambassadors at the EU level met on Sunday. The Commission College met first thing on Monday. I mean, it's not like there was no coordination. And I think we as Europeans should stop making ourselves look even weaker than, some might argue we are. And it is hard on a very complex issue like Iran and the Middle East to find a coordinated position. I don't think the E3 did so badly in their joint statement. You're not going to align everyone among 27. Let's push ahead. Let's see what we need to do to protect European interests and knock on and spillover effects that we're going to see. Keep our citizens, our economy, and our interests in order. So I'm not saying everything's going perfect, but let's be a little bit more confident in what we are achieving to do. And for example, also how European leaders have managed the huge pressures and provocations from the Trump administration the first year. I don't think we did so badly as Europe. Pivot to U.S. policy in the Western Balkans. Look, of course, this administration is deprioritizing Europe, and it's asking the Europeans to do more. And I think the Western Balkans is part of that. And this sort of three-part strategy that you're describing, so one of pushing certainly other actors out, especially Russia and China, pushing energy diversification based on U.S. energy imports into the region and the infrastructure that goes with it. As I said last week, the summit, very clear a sign of that. The Nice sanctions. I mean, you can find the entire discussion around vertical corridor. I think that's the second one. And then thirdly, certainly some level of stability. But I think there's overall a relatively good understanding of what immediate U.S. interests are. And those are the three. And that's what this administration that has really, in many ways, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with the prioritization or not, it has prioritized significantly of how it approaches U.S. influence and policy around the world, and that's what we're seeing here too. Doesn't mean the Western Balkans are irrelevant to the United States, but it is very much narrowing and a narrowing of prioritizations.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Well, I agree with that. And not only that, but for a long time now, the U.S., after, so let's say, Kosovo independence, has basically delegated the Europeans to take care of this part of their backyard and saying, we'll back you up, we'll help you. The famous doctrine of George Bush Sr., Europe at peace, free and the whole, was sort of a thing that was being applied. You know, you go ahead, we'll help you, we'll back you up. If these people reform, they want to go in, we'll back you up, and that's about it. You know, that's what we do. This was before Trump was around. Yeah. Okay. So that, but now these new priorities are all setting in, as you said. But then that leaves the question of Europe, and is it capable now? And then when you look at it from the outside, if you look at it from a very long distance, you say, look, on various issues of Europe, what baffles people if they take a view from Mars, they would say, look, you have 450 million people there. They're educated, they're rich, they have good universities, they have good firms, they have good plants, they have good at engineering. What's their problem? They're not a poor set of countries in East Africa or anything. They are, you know, they should be doing much better than they do, and they should be much better organized. And they could take care of their little backyard, which is practically nothing, which is the Western Balkans. Over all these years, they could have pushed for reform. They could have taken them in, instead of what has been going on so far with very, very sort of tentative approaches now. Yes, maybe we'll take somebody in. Now, all of this has a cost, Nicholas, right? All of this not being in the European Union has a cost, and we have the growth plan, and we have various issues over there, and then we had a whole set of things being done by the European Union to postpone this whole thing. And if they really want to be a geopolitical player, the easiest thing for them to do is take care of the Western Balkans. It's so small in terms of population, and it's right in the backyard, surrounded by EU members countries, and mostly NATO countries. So what is it costing us not to be in? We all pretty much know that. But given the state of the economy in the Western Balkans and the lack of convergence and the postponing of this, Europe is actually letting this becoming a backwater of Europe. All the countries that are coming in are getting extra funds. These are not available to these countries. And it's a very slow train, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not putting all the blame on Brussels or the European countries. There's also plenty of blame at home in the not enough effort in a lot of the reforms that should have been done. So the stabilocracies here, as they're called, have not been doing their homework to a great extent. So how do you see all this, and where do we go from here, especially now that, you know, because when I read the IMF reports, they're so rosy about, for example, here, or, you know, oh, everything is fine, et cetera, and then you come to the conclusion, you look at several basic facts. Very low growth rates, basically, compared to what is needed in terms of convergence. This was said at another panel a minute ago. This morning we heard the governor. And let me just add a few things. We have no correspondence between nominal GDP and growth rates whatsoever. It's a totally unrealistic thing. We have a large current deficit with a fixed exchange rate that's probably overvalued by 30%. None of this gets mentioned in some of these reports by the international financial institutions. So I'm wondering, you know, what kind of picture are we painting, and are we really facing the reality, and is the European Union a part of solving these problems and helping solve these problems in some kind of way?
Thanks. I guess the topic is quite complex. What I would say is that the EU has been a formidable convergence machine over the years. If you look at the 30 countries that moved from into the high income category since 1990, 30 countries in the world. You got the Uruguays, the Chiles, you got the Gulf countries, you got the odd sort of Trinidad and Tobago oil exporters, Equatorial Guinea in Africa. But if you look at those 30 countries, 15 have done so inside the European Union. Greece did it, Portugal, Malta, and then Poland, Romania, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and the list goes on. You know the countries, right? So the short question is, how do you converge faster with the EU? Well, get into the EU. But of course, you can take that as, I mean, it's not a joke, but it's difficult to get into the EU. But I really do think that nowhere since the Thessaloniki promise that you mentioned is there an avenue open for the Western Balkans now to enter the EU. And then the reality of the fact there is a new growth plan for the Western Balkans that the EU has put in place, but reforms also need to happen. And so it's a sort of, you can look at it, and because, you know, if you look at the growth, I'm sitting next to Professor Uvalic. You told us this morning, 1990s, the last decade for the Western Balkans in terms of growth because of course, the conflict and permanent, I think, shock on these economies. Then you have the golden period, 2000, 2008, when reforms were made and the Western Balkans grew at decent speed. But then, since the economic crisis of 2008 to today, growth has been sluggish, I would say. Yeah? So the reason is why. What has limited, what has hindered growth, let's say, from the global financial crisis of 2008 moving forward? And there are four things, I think, that emerge from the literature, some of the stuff that you have written, but in other reports, the fund, the bank, others, and so four things. One is this incomplete transition to a full-fledged market economy. No? You've done your first generation reforms, but then you kind of stopped, the Western Balkans. So you still have these prominent state-owned enterprises that capture market shares in the economy, and the business environment has not really improved as it should have been. That's number one. Number two, governance. We said it yesterday, you said it today, other people have said it. Look at the governance indicators in the Western Balkans vis-a-vis the new member state in the past 10, 15, 20 years. I'm talking about regulatory quality, government effectiveness, control of corruption, the rule of law. They'll be sliding down. So institutions, without institutions, you're not going to go very far. And this is something that is very clear in the economic and institutional literature. Third thing is limited trade and integration. The region has become highly fragmented. There have been territorial disputes that are persisting, of course, political conflict, but also on the economic side, non-tariff barriers, burdensome border procedure. One only has to drive around the region to see these queues that, since I got here 5 years ago, they seem to be getting longer and longer rather than shorter and shorter, of trucks waiting at the border with Hungary if you go that way, or Croatia if you go the other way. And then, still weak human capital vis-a-vis, that's number four, the new member states. So we have this vicious cycle with emigration, brain drain, skill mismatches in the labor market, and relatively poor education outcomes. So these things need to be corrected. So you say, okay, what to do? But you kind of flip these barriers on the other side. So you need to do second generation reforms, roll back your SOEs, think about deepening your financial markets, the product market, liberalize them, improve the business environment, boost human capital, think about what is going to be the labor market on the future. How do you build the human capital? For instance, in Serbia, you need to bring more women and more youth, young adults, into the labor market. Still has some labor force participation rates for women and for youth that are very, very low vis-a-vis other new member states. Then strengthen your institutions. I know governance is very difficult to improve, right? But maybe you can take advantage of digitalization, of AI to strengthen the contract between government and citizen, providing services in a more transparent way. I'm trying to be, how do you say, thinking outside of the box, because governance and reforms are very, very difficult to undertake. Boost regional connectivity. Now the green lanes, hopefully they will come into reality at some point. And then also, look at the digital transition, the opportunity that you use, the green transition, and so on. So there is, I think, a well-identified set of reforms. And as I said, with this avenue now ready for the Western Balkans to get in, these countries need to deliver on these reforms as well. So it takes two to tango. No? And as you can see, Montenegro, Albania, and now the front runners, and I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 2 years they're going to get in. And I think there is a unique opportunity for Serbia also to take. Serbia's future can only be in the European Union, in my opinion.
No, I agree. The reforms need to be done. There's no doubt about it. But on one point, I've done several pieces, econometric stuff on convergence is gone in the European Union. It's gone. Since the 2008, it's gone. So that's not going to happen, even for the countries that are in right now. But let me, does anybody want to make a very short point? Because I just want to take maybe one or two questions. Anybody wants to make a short point? Milica, you want to make a short point?
Just wanted to add to the discussion about the EU being the convergence machine. I fully agree, and the study you have done for the World Bank with your colleagues is one of the last ones that have been published on this issue. And these four factors that you have mentioned, if the Western Balkans were to reach the norms, the level of institutions, education, your estimates show that they would actually have a 1% higher growth rates than they have today, which is very remarkable. And it's not only because of the money. The countries that are in the EU get enormous amounts of funding through cohesion policies, which is much, much more with respect to the Western Balkans. But it's also the discipline. Countries have to adopt certain policies. Look at Croatia. Croatia has gone through a very difficult period initially, but then things have been going much better in the meantime. A minister was jailed because of corruption. I mean, many things are better in the EU than outside.
I agree. I'm just saying what I'm saying. It not only is it was the only convergence machine in the world, but that's gone. That's history. That's what I'm trying to say. That's finished so far. Anybody? You want to make any short points? Anybody? Any questions? If you have any questions, please identify yourself and be short. Anybody? I can't see from over here. We're all in the dark. So, if there are no questions, a short comment by anybody? The last two sentences by anybody? Stefan?
Maybe just very briefly, because didn't really talk about Western Balkans that much. Western Balkans is in the current state of affairs where we are kind of reaching a tipping point. Whether we will become part of European community one way or another, or whether we will have a situation in which we do turn towards the other alternatives, regardless of whether that is a logical move to do or not. And among those other alternatives, I do count the United States as well. Because at the moment, we are seeing that the promise of enlargement kind of falls within the chosen ones, not throughout the region, rightfully so or not is to be debated. But I'm afraid that if that happens, could potentially be a final nail in the coffin of European perspective of some of the countries within the region. Because the level of disappointment would be immeasurable. And that is something that I'm afraid that if it happens, the very devoted minority of pro-European fanatics within the region, I'm not sure how we will conceal even theirs persuasion into the European future, and that it is bright for the region.
John, sure.
I would just say, look, I think there's plenty of blame to be placed since 2003 on the European and /EU side. And first, to admit that, I would also stress, though, rather than trying to predict how real any of this is on the EU side, and I'm actually a little bit more positive. I do believe Montenegro has a chance. I think there is a changed geopolitical dynamic. Albania, we'll see how that, still a lot of reforms happening there. But I would just stress the region has agency, and rather than waiting to see whether the European Union will make the case by actually doubling down on the reforms and doing the hard work of that. And op-eds by presidents and prime ministers that suggest just let us into the single market and then we'll give up our veto power. I don't think that's the way forward. I'm sorry, that's not agency of the countries themselves doing the hard job that EU accession is.
I agree. I'll end this with a with a joke on a Boy Scout. He comes home all battered up and you know, in shambles, and his father asked him what happened. He says, you know, we're supposed to do one good deed every day. He says, okay, so what's the problem? What did you do today? He said, I helped an old lady cross the street. He says, so what was the problem? She didn't want to cross. So they got beat up. So, I mean, to make your point, you know, if we don't want to do it, then all of this talk about the European Union really fades into oblivion and is immaterial. So anyway, we've come to an end. Thank you so much for attending. Let me please let me thank the panel for this lively discussion and for all of you being here, and especially to John, who took a long trip from Washington.